January 13th, 2025. China's Customs Administration released its 2024 trade figures. One line went almost completely unnoticed. China's exports to Vietnam had grown 18% to $163 billion, making Vietnam, for the first time, a larger destination for Chinese exports than Japan. China now sends more goods to a country of 100 million people than it does to the world's third largest economy. Here is why that matters more than almost any other trade figure published this year. For the past decade, Western companies have been moving factories out of China and into Vietnam. They called it de-risking. They called it reducing dependency on China. What they built, without fully realizing it, was a supply chain that still runs on Chinese inputs, just assembled somewhere else. China did not lose its factory status to Vietnam. It extended its factory into Vietnam. And it is the most strategically sophisticated economic maneuver that almost nobody in the West is talking about. But the story does not start with trade data. It starts with a decision made in the boardroom in Seoul in 2008, and one company that unintentionally designed the blueprint for everything that followed. To understand what China built, you need to understand why companies started leaving in the first place. For 3 decades, China was the undisputed factory of the world. By the early 2000s, Made in China was not a label. It was the default assumption for almost every manufactured product in the Western world. 2 things changed by 2010. Chinese wages were rising fast. The average urban manufacturing wage in China reached over $1,200 per month by 2023. In Vietnam, the average factory wage in 2024 was approximately $302 per month, a cost gap of more than 4 to 1. To put that in human terms, the average Vietnamese factory worker earns in a month what their Chinese counterpart earns in just over 1 week. The second shift was geopolitics. In 2018, the first Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods. Companies that had spent decades optimizing their Chinese supply chains suddenly needed a different answer. Vietnam provided that answer. A young population, over half under 35. A coastline built for export shipping. A shared border with China, which meant raw materials could cross in days. Before this becomes an abstract story about trade flows, consider something you probably own. Your AirPods, if you have a pair, were almost certainly assembled in Vietnam. Apple moved that production to escape US-China tariff exposure. But the company doing the assembling is Luxshare Precision Industry, headquartered in Dongguan, Guangdong, in China. Luxshare built factories in Bacjiang province from 2019 and is today the world's largest single producer of AirPods. An American product, assembled in Vietnam by a Chinese company. The label says Vietnam. The supply chain logic says China. That is not an anomaly. That is the architecture. Samsung was the company that arrived first at scale, and what it built in Vietnam between 2009 and 2020 became the template that every other multinational would eventually follow. In 2008, Samsung began construction of its first mobile phone factory in Bac Minh province. By 2023, Samsung had invested $22 billion in Vietnam, employed approximately 90,000 workers, and was producing approximately half of all Samsung mobile phones made anywhere in the world. Samsung alone accounted for roughly 15% of Vietnam's total exports in 2024. One company. That is extraordinary concentration, and it tells you how fast this industrial base was built. But what Samsung also did, which the headline figures rarely capture, was pull an entire ecosystem of suppliers with it. Its global supply chain partners followed it into Vietnam. And crucially, many of those suppliers were Chinese companies, or Chinese-owned factories that simply relocated across the border. In 2011, China ranked 14th among foreign investors in Vietnam. By 2023, it had reached the top position. In 2024, China represented 28.3% of all new investment projects registered in Vietnam, more than any other country. That trajectory is the central fact of this entire story. And most Western analysis of Vietnam's rise has not properly accounted for it. As Western companies moved final assembly to Vietnam, they continued buying components from China. The factories changed flags. The supply chains did not. For Vietnam's garment and textile industry, over 60% of raw materials are imported from abroad, with China the single largest source. For electronics components, China accounts for roughly 32% of Vietnam's imports in that category. In 2024, Vietnam imported $144 billion worth of goods from China, a 30% increase in a single year. The goods leave Vietnamese ports labeled "Made in Vietnam." The inputs that made them came from Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Fujian. And this brings us to the question that the US government, the EU Trade Commission, and every major importing economy is now quietly trying to answer. At what point does "Made in Vietnam" stop meaning Vietnam? And what happens when that answer becomes politically inconvenient?
The Lowy Institute, drawing on Asian Development Bank trade data, found that in 2022, approximately 28% of Vietnam's exports to the United States reflected indirect Chinese content, up from just 9% in 2018. That means roughly 28 cents of every dollar of Vietnamese goods arriving in American ports originated in China. 4 years earlier, that figure was less than a tenth of that. To be clear, more than 70% of Vietnam's U.S. exports still reflects genuine Vietnamese value: local labor, South Korean and Japanese components, domestic processing. Vietnam is not simply a transit hub, but 28% and rising is a number that governments act on. In 2024, the U.S. imposed additional duties on Vietnamese solar panels after investigators found excessive Chinese content. Now, step back and look at what China actually did, because the strategic logic is more sophisticated than most coverage acknowledges. When Western companies began leaving after 2018, Beijing had two options: keep them through subsidies, pressure, protectionism, or let them go, while ensuring the supply chains they built elsewhere still ran through Chinese firms, Chinese materials, and Chinese capital. It chose the second. Chinese manufacturers facing U.S. tariffs began investing in Vietnamese factories directly. They could export components to their own Vietnamese subsidiaries, assemble finished goods, and ship to America as Vietnamese exports, no longer subject to China-specific tariffs. In 2024, Chinese companies launched 28.3% of all new manufacturing investment projects in Vietnam. The country Western companies moved to in order to escape China dependency is simultaneously becoming one of China's most important manufacturing satellites. The geography changed. The economic beneficiary largely did not. Which is why Vietnam is now attempting something no country in the region has tried at this speed: build enough domestic supply chain depth to reduce Chinese input dependency, without alienating the Chinese investors who are funding the very factories that need those inputs. The West spent 7 years trying to decouple from China. What it built instead was a more complex version of the same dependency. The factories moved. The components did not. This is not a failure of intent. It is a reflection of what took China 30 years to build. China accounts for roughly 28 to 31% of global manufacturing output. Vietnam's share is approximately 0.6%. The The supply chain was lengthened. It was not replaced. What Vietnam has become is China's most important downstream extension. And the question nobody has a clean answer to: can Vietnam build enough local content, enough Vietnamese-owned suppliers, enough domestic technological capability to reduce that structural dependency, without losing the Chinese investment that is currently funding the entire process? That is the question that determines whether Vietnam becomes an independent industrial power or remains China's most profitable factory extension. Global supply chains are not rerouted by political declarations. They are rerouted by economics, slowly, partially, and rarely in the direction the declarations intended. What China built in Vietnam is not a concession. It is an extension. And understanding that distinction changes how you read almost every trade headline from this part of the world. One thing I'd genuinely like to know: do you think Vietnam can realistically build enough domestic supply chain depth within the next decade? Or has China's structural position made that effectively impossible? Leave your answer in the comments. This is the third video in a series on how China uses economic architecture as geopolitical leverage. The previous one is called "Trump Raised Tariffs to 27%. Did it actually work?" It covers exactly the tariff policy that accelerated Vietnam's rise, and why, despite billions of dollars of trade policy, the underlying dependency barely shifted. The two videos together tell one complete story. It's on screen right now. If you want to understand the systems shaping the global economy before they surface in mainstream coverage, subscribe. That is what this channel is built for.